Good morning, Facebook. So as usual, I just wanted to take a second and a couple minutes of your time and kind of go over some details about how displacement and extinction work for the descendants of slaves. Number one, we want to define the reason for displacement and extinction. So we all know the history of America and how America was essentially built off the backs of free labor, right? But America, for whatever reason, chose not to eliminate those slaves. It chose to free them. And in freeing the slaves, what then happens is that you promote a reminder of slavery itself. You promote a reminder of slavery itself through the very existence of the descendants of those slaves, right? Because we always bring up the injustice that America imposed upon us. And the reality is no one wants to hear this. No one wants to hear how this injustice was imposed upon the descendants of slaves. So in an attempt to do today what should have been done then is the displacement. And to help you understand what displacement is, so if you have a tub full of water, right, and I get into the tub full of water, the water that spills out was displaced by me getting in. So once I come in, the water goes out. That's displacement. And what's happening with the displacement of African Americans is across many fields in the country where blacks had higher percentages or dominated in particular fields. You find that blacks, the descendants of slaves, no longer, the numbers are being reduced by the replacement of other people. Excuse me. And so I'll give you an example here, particularly talking about baseball. So let's give a little history first about Major League Baseball. The first thing is we are always told that Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. But if you Google who was the first African American, or who was the first descendant of slave to play in the Major League Baseball, it was not Jackie Robinson. There was a player by the name of Moses Fleetwood Walker who played a year in the majors before Jackie Robinson did. But the reason that he is not determined to be the one to break the color barrier is because he was an outspoken African American. He was outspoken about his heritage as an African, as a descendant of slaves. And whenever you're outspoken about slavery, understand that you are not going to be supported by the mainstream, right? So that's why he wasn't supported. Now, when you talk about Jackie Robinson, one of the reasons Jackie Robinson has been framed as breaking the color barrier, in his contract, you may not know this, in his contract, he agreed to turn the other cheek. Like, it was a part of his contract that he had to accept white anger, right? That he couldn't respond when he was called niggers and other racist names. It was in his contract that he could not respond. And so one of the things I listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson out of Toronto. He's a professor. He's a psychologist. I think he has his PhD in psychology. But he's a professor at the University of Toronto, and he's also taught at been a professor. I think it was 3 years, a professor at Harvard, and he talks about dominance hierarchies, right? Particularly male dominance hierarchies, but he talks about dominance hierarchies in general as well. There's a female dominance hierarchy as well. But when he talks about male dominance hierarchy, he always talks about that anybody can elevate in the hierarchy as long as they don't pose a threat to the hierarchy itself. And so if you know a little bit about the history of African Americans, there was a concept during slavery called I can't even remember the name of it now. Anyway, I can't remember the name of it now. It's just embarrassing. But there was a process where any black who helped expose rebellions from slaves was rewarded, or any black that worked to keep blacks in their place in white supremacy was also rewarded as well. So if you were black and you helped white supremacy, then you were rewarded by white supremacy, so that you could elevate your own life by making sure that no one else threatened the hierarchy itself. So I bring up Jackie Robinson. I bring up the fact that in his contract was essentially, I think it was called meritorious manumission, right? So Jackie Robinson promised not to essentially fight back against white supremacy. That as long as he fought back, as long as he didn't fight back against white supremacy, that he would be welcome. And that is what happened. He's been a very honored player by Major League Baseball. And you can see, so when you talk about the difference between somebody like Moses Fleetwood Walker, you're talking about an athlete like the San Francisco 49ers quarterback. I can't even remember his name. Colin Kaepernick, right? The NFL doesn't want those kind of outspoken players that speak out against the injustices against African Americans, right? Sports don't want those type of athletes, right? They want you to. They actually prefer that you kind of be more of the you can do anything type of athlete, that you can overcome anything type of athlete, and then that way all the responsibility of white supremacy is put on the individual and not the system itself. And so that's what you start to see across the board for African Americans, right? And so the system itself of white supremacy will celebrate and honor and uplift anybody that puts the individual responsibility on the descendants of slaves, so that it doesn't have to deal with the injustices and the impediments that were created for the descendants of slaves as a result of slavery and Jim Crow and so on and so forth. So anyway, nevertheless, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, right? And he did it in a way that did not pose a threat to the white dominance hierarchy. And so he's been rewarded for that. His name has been honored in the sport. The sport doesn't bring up Moses Fleetwood Walker at all. It doesn't bring his name up, right? Because he was an outspoken descendant of slaves. And so when you look at the numbers, the color barrier was broken in 1947. So in 1947, as a result of him breaking the color barrier, there was a little less than 1% of African Americans made up, had contracts with Major League Baseball. The highest it got for black players in the majors was 18.7 in 1981. So 18.7% of Major League Baseball players were African American in 1981. In 2016, it was 6.7. So you ask, what happened to all the black players? Because that's like this, you lost 12%. You lost 12% of your players' positions in Major League Baseball. But Latinos, and I think in 2015, were 28.7% of Major League Baseball players. So the number of white players have reduced, and the number of black players have reduced, and the number of Latino players has exploded. Now, why is this important? So when you talk about displacement, right? Because when you look at Latino players, they come from Puerto Rico, they come from Cuba, they come from the Dominican Republic, right? They come from these Hispanic or Latino countries, and right, so that money that they now make from Major League Baseball goes back to their countries to reinvest into Major League Baseball to keep developing and bringing those players over here to the States. And they're not doing anything wrong per se. But every year, Major League Baseball honors Jackie Robinson, right, for breaking the color barrier. But Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier has not been to the benefit of the descendants of slaves, right? It was when the sport wasn't open to other people, but as it has become more open to Latinos and Asians, blacks are being displaced. So as other people come in, blacks are out. And one of the reasons that blacks are out is it's just too much of a risk to have blacks have wealth and power and be able to facilitate and speak out. In other words, we're less likely to have Colin Kaepernick if we don't have black players, black players who are descendants of slaves. If we don't have those type of players in the sport, then we don't have the issues of a Colin Kaepernick type of player, right? And the only reason that the displacement hasn't happened, and like they're attempting it in basketball, like you see in basketball, the NBA is going global, and they're trying to. They're spending money and investing and making these other players great so they can displace the NBA. But the NBA is still predominantly black. That may not be the case in years to come. In the NFL, it's probably never going to be the case just because of the risk of playing the sport, right? And so essentially, when you play football, you cut years off your life. And for many people, it's just not worth it. So that's why you don't see people from other countries investing in football in the way that African Americans do, right? The same with a sport like boxing. Like African Americans dominate the sport of boxing because we are willing to take the risk to receive the payout, but the costs are too great for other people to take, so they don't take those risks in those sports. But in a sport like baseball, baseball players live long. Because number one, they have some of the best health care. They're paid very well, so they live a good life. And a good life, and it's a good, healthy life. I mean, the sport of baseball is physical, but it's not physical like football and basketball, where you have baseball players live into their 80s and 90s. You don't have football players that live into their 80s and 90s. Football players are dying between 40, 45, and I'll say 65. So they die earlier than other athletes. But the point I'm making is that the risk reward is not worth it for other people. But in baseball, it is. The risk reward is great, which is why you have a lot of Asians coming over to the States, and the Asians have an Asian baseball league. They have other baseball leagues in some of the Latin countries, but African Americans don't have a baseball league. So the question is, what happened to the baseball league of the African Americans? When Jackie Robinson crossed the color barrier, it essentially destroyed the Negro League. The Negro League is why Jackie Robinson had the opportunity, right? Because his opportunities were in the Negro Leagues because of the color barrier. But once the color barrier was broke, Major League Baseball was able to essentially disrespect the contracts that black baseball players had in the Negro League and just essentially destroy the Negro League. So I think within 5 years of Jackie Robinson crossing the color barrier, the Negro League was destroyed. Now, China has a league. Japan has a league, right? These Latin countries, they all have leagues to develop their players. And when their players make money in the States, they give money back to those leagues in order to develop more players. Meanwhile, blacks don't have a way to develop more players, right? We don't have a Negro League anymore. That league is gone. And so, and Major League Baseball is not interested in developing African American baseball players because it doesn't have to. These other players are giving money back. They're giving back to their own communities, developing players. So blacks are being displaced. And soon blacks will be extinct in Major League Baseball. Remember, I told you in 1981, when I was growing up as a kid, there were a lot of African American baseball players. People like Ozzie Smith, Terry Pendleton, Willie McGee. I know they're all Cardinals, but you had players from other teams as well. And you had players like the guy who played for Seattle. I don't do sports as much as most people do, but there was a Ken Griffey Jr., right? Then you had in the 90s and 2000s, you had Barry Bonds, right? You had all these African American baseball players, but you don't see a whole lot of players like that now, right? And obviously, you're not going to see a lot of black players. I think the Cardinals have one African American player on the team, maybe two, maybe two. But the point is that there are teams in the major leagues today that have no black players on them. But you know, and this is how displacement works, right? That you break the barrier, you do the work, you take the ridicule, you make all the sacrifices, and then everybody else benefit. And none of those players, like Latino and Asian players, don't put money into development of African American players. The major leagues in general don't put money back into the development of African American players. So in name, they honor African Americans by honoring Jackie Robinson, but the reality is they're honoring Jackie Robinson to opening up Major League Baseball to other markets, not opening up the opportunities for African Americans, because those opportunities for African Americans have dwindled essentially in our face without any pushback from African Americans. And so I talk about how this is a reflection of the overall extinction of African Americans, right? So when you talk about, so I posted a status on Facebook earlier today about 40% of black Ivy League students are African. 40% of black Ivy League students are African. And many of them get the opportunities to attend these schools as a result. And I'm not saying they don't work hard, right? If you have to work hard to go to an Ivy League school, but many of them have benefited from affirmative action, from affirmative action laws, right? That there's a certain percentage of people of color that we want in the schools, and Africans fit the bill, because Africans are going to do two things, right? Africans are not going to turn out to be Cornel West or Michael Eric Dyson or Yvette Carnell or Boyce Watkins, right? They are not going to be those type of people that understand the history of America and the conditions of the descendant of slaves, right? So what America wants to do is they want to appear diverse, but they don't want to upset the hierarchy. And immigrants will do that just well, right? Because immigrants just want to be a part of these opportunities, right? They don't want to upset the hierarchy. And the reality is African Americans don't want to upset the hierarchy either, except the hierarchy is built on our backs, right? That we have made all the sacrifices. Listen, when I tell you this, no one has made more sacrifices for this country than African Americans, than the descendants of slaves. No one has made more sacrifices for this country than the African slaves and their descendants, and receive less in benefits. And that makes people uncomfortable. It makes people uncomfortable to have to deal with the reality that we've sacrificed the most and gotten the least in return from this country, right? And so it's just easier to have other people come here and get their piece of the pie without any conflict to the dominance hierarchy system as it is. And so this is why you are being displaced and essentially going to be extinct, right? That you are going to be a permanent underclass that is used to churn the economic system of America. That's what's happening to you. And Major League Baseball is a reflection of that, right? That they honor Jackie Robinson, and they even claim to honor the Negro Leagues, right? But not the descendants of slaves. You aren't honored. You aren't given the honor of having a certain number of slots specifically for you as a result of the sacrifices that you had to make for everybody else to get in. And I'm saying all these people come into the major leagues, right, as a result of the sacrifices of Jackie Robinson, right, and the early African Americans that essentially took all the racial taunts and all the couldn't sleep in the same hotels and all of that stuff that they had to go through to create these opportunities for other people that don't have to give back to the people that made those sacrifices, right? Nobody gives back. We create all the opportunities. Nobody else says thank you. They think that the opportunities just exist, but it just wasn't And that's not the case, and it wasn't the case. And so just take a second, like and share the video, listen to the video, give me your feedback, tell me what you think about the displacement and the extinction of African Americans, and why that's going to be the case, and why it is going to happen. It is going to happen. It's not, you know, people are going to fight. There are people fighting, and I commend those people who fight, and I'll fight with them. But the reality is we are going to lose. And I'm telling you, we're going to lose because there are too many of us that have an open arms for people who come into our community as friends but betray us every time, and we never see the betrayal. And if that's going to be our position, we're done. We're done.